It's hard to believe, but Escape from Tarkov is nearing release. That means it's a great moment to reminisce about some truly cool features from early versions that were later cut from the game forever. Who knows, maybe the developers will remember them too. Don't forget to hit like and let's dive in. The main killer feature of Escape from Tarkov has always been its weaponry, and it's where the most significant changes have occurred. In the early alpha versions, weapons had more pronounced screen shake during sudden movements, and the interior and weight of the guns were more noticeable. There was a real sense of liveliness to the character, just compare it. However, to be fair, this is entirely unrealistic. Either the character always had relaxed hands or they simply don't know how to handle the weapons. Now, our experience at PMC holds the weapon much steadier and doesn't swing it around like a madman as seen in Bodycam, for example. On the other hand, if the developers want to depict arm fatigue, after all, you can't walk around with raised weapons for too long. It would be logical to add the low ready stance, as seen in Groundbranch or Road to Vostok. By the way, such a stance was teased back in 2016. Additionally, previously, weapons would more cinematically collide with various obstacles, and the difference between long and compact assemblies was more pronounced, but even that was unrealistic. Not only would the character often bump into walls or even other characters, rendering themselves combat ineffective, which looked extremely silly. But in reality, nobody points their weapons at an obstacle if there is just a couple centimeters of space in front of them. Usually the weapon is tucked under the arm or against the shoulder, which is what the character does now. They'll try to remain combat readiness for as long as possible, and only when you get extremely close to the wall will the weapon move away from the line of fire. What was realistic and atmospheric though were the dirt and glare in the scopes. Optics had a glass effect, collimator sights were dirty and could slightly glare in the sun, and reticles were slightly more realistic. Now, all scopes are crystal clear and transparent and the reticles are perfectly sharp. Perhaps it bothered streamers and the broader audience that came to Tarkov from more casual projects in 2018 and 2019, but the feature was genuinely interesting and it's somewhat regrettable that it was removed. The same goes for flashlights. Previously, the light from flashlights gently filled the entire space in buildings, genuinely illuminating dark areas well. Perhaps it added extra strain on the systems, or maybe it was simply turned off and forgotten about it. But the fact is, these reflections in the game exist. At least a couple of years ago, data miners found this setting and easily enabled it in the current versions of Tarkov at that time. The long-awaited underslung grenade launcher has finally returned to the game, but the explosion effects have been disappointing. They still resemble firecracker pops to this day. Previously, grenade explosions would induce a tinnitus effect, a ringing in the ears, kick up dust and leave burning debris in the air. And that's not even mentioning the damage. Some grenades packed up so much punch that even the thrower was wary, while the myth of the F1 grenade shrapnel spreading 200 meters is just that, a myth, pertaining perhaps only to particularly large fragments. From a gameplay perspective, if we still had grenades that powerful, player would think twice before running straight into explosions. On a positive note, the addition of the primer popping sound is a welcome addition, something that was missing from the game's focus on a particular realism for several years. However, even here, the developers forgot about smoke, which in reality isn't as scarce as depicted. And where would be without the eternal saga of Recoil? Its changes shake up the weapon balance from patch to patch, becoming something akin to a local meme. If at the alpha's release, Recoil was particularly non-existent, allowing for calmly spraying long bursts almost on target, even without customization. Then later they increased Recoil by a third, then increased it even more, then started playing with hidden parameters, further attempting to change the entire system, showing us this. And that. And finally, we seem to have somewhat acceptable recoil parameters. At least meta builds don't differ threefold from regular weapons anymore. And at least now the full range of customization makes sense, rather than giving debuffs. But even here, it reaches absurdity. Some weapons skid not backwards, as one can imagine even without firing a real weapon, but forward. Pistols. They just can't seem to fix them, showing this nightmare, then rolling everything back. In general, either the saga will continue or the developers will simply leave everything as it is, because the current version is definitely better than anything before it. It's hard not to agree that the alpha version of Tarkov looked different in a special way. It had a unique color palette, atmospheric dawns, and beautiful sunset, grim corners, and that very spirit of Tarkov. As you know, Tarkov grew out of the browser game Contract Wars, literally borrowing assets from there. Today, of course, many of them have been updated, but to this day you can still find old models in Tarkov, some even from the early builds of Russia 2028 dated back in 2010. And even today, the same Contract Wars looks quite decent, and when you look at the latest location from 2013 and 2014 and compare them with EFT, it seems that the browser-based old-timer in terms of atmosphere at least does not yell to Tarkov. That rain, volumetric dust on the location, that color palette. Developers have been promising to update the graphics for several years now. Discussing about the features like sunbeams have been circulating since 2017, but it's still not entirely clear what BSG means by the supposedly upcoming graphics improvement. The character movement has undergone many changes. Well, the movement mechanics are clumsy as they were, but now they're adorned with 1,000 mechanics that the game itself doesn't know how to handle, such as aiming while laying on your side or being near objects. On the bright side, the character is no longer able to casually jump from the third floor without taking damage. Finally, there is stamina overload, and finally there is a need to eat and drink. Although it's still rather primitive, the insanely beautiful yet extremely clumsy feature of pulling the character towards door handles and crates was also permanently removed. Now we almost magically open all the doors and crates with a wave of the hand, but in the alpha the character was pulled into a special position when they gracefully reach for the handle, much like how it happens now when breaching doors or unlocking them with a key. Unfortunately, such a clumsiness is unacceptable in multiplayer shooter, especially considering that Tarkov itself is extremely clumsy and still doesn't allow interrupting any action. Once you start an animation, you're stuck with it, unable to drop the darn door and fight back against enemies. Also, COD was inverse kinematics of the legs when you walked on uneven surfaces. The character placed their feet precisely on every bump, rock, or a pile of garbage. It looked beautiful, but in the pursuit of any kind of optimization, this feature was sacrificed. In the alpha, there was also the concept of pain shock. When the health of a limb dropped to zero, any new damage to that limb would immediately kill the player, and there were no surgical kits. You had to limp to the exit and pray you didn't stumble upon barbed wire or get prepped by scavs from 100 meters away. Now even pain shock itself is removed and damaged limbs can be restored. Indeed, like with the grenades, it's a controversial feature, but definitely interesting and unique. Moreover, any damage was perceived by the character not just as a fact, but with a serious aim punch. The character flinched so strongly that the damage felt almost physically, which was incredibly disorienting. Again, a controversial feature that was eventually cut, but with the focus back down on the maximum realism, it seemed to fit the game perfectly, don't you think? On top of all this, it wouldn't hurt to have the long promised stress factor, so that the character would shoot something in stressful situations and with low stress resistance skill. However, in the alpha there was at least a simple imitation of this. The character often screamed, for example when throwing grenades or killing enemies. And plants remain plants. And speaking of plants, it also worth remembering a whole list of promised features that were not present in the alpha and still haven't appeared in the game to this day. If you want a video with a detailed analysis of this, write in comments. Did you play the Tarkov alpha? Which features do you miss? Or if you're seeing them for the first time, which ones from the video would you like to see back in Tarkov? Thank you for likes, subscriptions, and see you later.